everyone. Welcome to TEDxReno Salon Series. I'm Kaya Stanley. I'm the organizer of TEDxReno, and we are so excited to have you here. So TEDxReno is a nonprofit organization dedicated to ideas worth spreading and ideas change the world. And we connected with Amy with Tahoe Fund because the big TEDx series that we do one time a year is the giant one where there's 15 to 19 talks and it's on all different topics, right? And I'm going to brag a little bit for my team because in case you don't know this, TEDxReno is one of the most successful in the world. Every year there's about 16,000 talks that go up to the YouTube channel, the TEDx YouTube channel that has about 40 million followers. In 2022, we had 5 of the top 100 and 3 of the top 30. And this year we just did an event in April, and we don't know our year results yet, but out of the 15 that we've had, 3 of them were in the top 10 of the month that they went out. Yes, exactly. I love that. 4 of them had already chose as editor's picks. 1 of them has already been invited to TED.com. So that's what TEDxReno is doing. So I'm really proud of our team. So TEDx salons are another part of TEDx where the goal is to integrate with the community year-round and do year-round programming. And TEDx salons are more deep dive as opposed to being a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So Amy and I were talking about, the State of the Lake report and all of the different research that's going on about water quality and the fact that Tahoe is known for its water clarity and water quality, so we thought this would be a really cool salon to do. So that's what we're here for. So I want to thank Lake Tahoe School for giving us this beautiful space to do this. I want to thank Green Pilot Films for doing the live stream and for doing our audio visual today, and Tahoe Fund for making this whole thing happen. But especially I want to really honor our volunteers and our panel. So I want to give a round of applause, and then I'm going to turn the whole program over to Amy. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Berry, CEO of the Tahoe Fund. And on behalf of our board of directors and our team, I want to welcome everybody and thank you for joining us. I think we've got a spectacular program for you tonight. The Tahoe Fund's mission is to use the power of philanthropy to improve the Lake Tahoe environment for all to enjoy. And what that means is we are very fortunate to raise a lot of private funding from some of you in the room today, from our donors. And we use that funding to help secure public funding or close funding gaps for environmental improvement projects all around the lake. Since our founding, we have raised a little over $25 million of philanthropic dollars to help secure more than $160 million of public funding for hundreds of projects. And we have 5 focus areas that we work with: forest health, sustainable recreation, transportation, stewardship, and of course, lake clarity. The lake's clarity is what makes Tahoe so iconic. So I'm so excited for tonight because we have some of the smartest minds working on lake clarity in the whole region here with us tonight to really deep dive into what's happening with the lake. So we're going to start with 2 presentations on 2 critical projects that are happening that are really having an impact on the lake's clarity and water quality. And then we're going to transition into a panel. A few housekeeping items. We will have the opportunity for Q&A. We have our team that has index cards that they'll be passing around to you. You can write your questions on the index cards and pass them back, and then we'll collect them, and then we'll do a Q&A after the panel. And I think that's all the housekeeping that I have to do. Check my notes. Okay, great. So we're going to start with rapid fire very quickly. We're really fortunate to have Dennis Zabaglo from the TRPA. He is their Aquatic Invasive Species Program Manager, and he's going to give us an update on the Taylor-Slack AIS project, the largest AIS control project in the lake, as well as the sort of recent introduction of New Zealand mudsnails. So Dennis, please join us.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you. Again, Dennis Zabaglo, the Aquatic Invasive Species Program Manager for TRPA. We'll just jump right into it since we only got a little bit of time, but these are 2 significant projects that we have going on. Both have been fortunate to receive funding through the Tahoe Fund, so thank you, Amy, and donors. We'll jump into mudsnails. New Zealand mudsnails, invasive from New Zealand. Surprise, surprise. Very small invasive snails, about the size of a grain of rice. First introduced in the United States. Okay, how about that? New Zealand mudsnails, very small invaders from New Zealand, about the size of a grain of rice. They're notorious throughout the United States. First introduction was in California. First introduction in California was in 2000 in the Owens River. And since that time, the closest infestation that we were aware of, closest to Tahoe, is west of Reno in the Truckee River. But like other invaders, they have very similar impacts to the lake. They outcompete our native species that really impact our delicate food web, which is critical to lake health, and also excrete nutrients in a concentrated fashion, which is really food for algal growth, and then certainly impacts to recreation. But this is an example of where they were found in Lake Tahoe. This is a grid survey that was done. So once they were discovered by divers doing sea plant surveys, Marine Taxonomic Services, they notified us and the Tahoe Resource Conservation District, one of my primary partners in the Aquatic Invasive Species Program, of their presence. We did, sorry about that. Notified us immediately. We implemented our rapid response plan. And one of the first things you do is try to get a better understanding of their distribution. And so we had divers in the water that same week to identify their delineation. So you can see here, these white dots represent negative detections with the colored dots representing detections. With the point that's kind of red, it's about 2,000 feet off the outlet of the upper Truckee River was the point of discovery. And so that's the highest concentration that we're seeing. And so we did surveys from as far west as Emerald Bay all the way up to Round Hill. And so all of those areas were negative detections, along with some environmental DNA. It's a high-tech analysis using DNA, environmental DNA to detect their presence. And in the tributaries on the South Shore, there's non-detected those as well. But they were discovered last year, September, about a year ago. The first new invader that has been detected since we started the boat inspection program. That's what we're doing now. We were fortunate to receive some funds through not only the Tahoe Fund to do one of the aspects I'll talk about, but also from the Fish and Wildlife Service to do additional monitoring. Really critical to understand their extent. So we're repeating that grid survey as we speak. And also, in addition to the eDNA sampling that was done on the South Shore, it's being expanded throughout the basin. So all of these blue spots on the left are points of eDNA sampling that we're doing. It's over 300, and that effort has been completed, and we're just waiting for the results of that to really understand their distribution on a regional basis. Other aspects, we worked with Sudeep, that you'll hear from momentarily, with the Tahoe Science Advisory Council, a team of experts on this subject matter, to give us some guidance on some of the steps we need to do. Education and monitoring is certainly a critical aspect. Unfortunately, there is no feasible control methods at this time, but that's something we need some additional funding for from a research perspective to really understand their long-term impacts to the lake. But is there some future way to help control these species? So outreach is really one of the main things that's been done to try to contain their spread. So we want to try to limit where they are in the lake without having them spread to other areas. So really focusing on that clean, drain, and dry mantra that we have for the Aquatic Invasive Species Program. So it's a simple directive technique that you can follow. Make sure your boat or paddlecraft or kayak is clean, drain, and dry of water, dirt, mud, invasive species. So we now have new roving inspectors that is funded through the Tahoe Fund that are engaging our recreators on the lake to inform them of aquatic invasive species issues. But this is some of the outreach that we're doing on the right, just alerting people to continue that clean, drain, and dry effort. So these are our rovers that we have this year. They've had over 3,500 interactions with recreators on the beach, really getting that message directly to them. We're learning a lot of valuable information from them. This is something we want to continue for the future. We're seeing very positive results with all the interactions, learning some ways, better ways to communicate and coordinate with some of those recreators. Getting Tahoe Keepers is our stewardship program. teaching recreators how to self-inspect and decontaminate their vessel to make sure it's clean, drain, and dry. We've had over 700 new members this year, which is more than what we had all of last year. So that's a big part of what these roving inspectors are doing. So also a new tool that we have is this CD3 machine. It's not a great name, so if anybody wants to come up with a cool name for this, that'd be great, but it is the name of the company. It stands for Clean, Drain, Dry, Dispose. But these are mobile units that can be positioned in strategic places around the lake to help recreators achieve that clean, drain, and dry status. It's a waterless machine. It has air, it has a vacuum, it has tongs, it has a way to dispose of any weeds or any fragments you might find on your boat. So we're taking this opportunity to, with the new discovery of mudsnails, and really using the tools that we can apply to any invasive species that we're worried about. So right now we have 2 of these. One was purchased with funds from the League to Save Lake Tahoe. The other is in partnership with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Washi Tribe. One is moving around at various places. As you can see here, it was at Sand Harbor a few weeks ago, now to the South Shore and into Falling Lake. And then one is also a trailer unit, but right now it's permanently stationed for the time being at Phoenix Bay Resort, operated by the Washi Tribe staff. The one thing we're learning through these, before I jump into Taylor Tlack, one thing we're learning with these roving inspectors is the locals aren't understanding that Tahoe has invasive species that some of our other water bodies in the region do not. Marlet Lake, Schooner Lake, Echo Lakes, Fall Leaf Lakes, they don't have Asian clams, they don't have weeds, they don't have New Zealand mudsnails, but Tahoe does. So it's really important to follow that clean, drain, and dry as you're recreating in between both water bodies or multiple water bodies. So moving into Taylor Tlack, if you've ever been to Baldwin Beach on the South Shore, it's a beautiful place, lots of recreation, beautiful marsh. So the importance of it ecologically rivals its beauty. It's the largest highly functioning wetland in the entire basin. So these are critical parts of our ecosystem that help filter nutrients and sediment before they reach the lake. And unfortunately, in this ecosystem, there's about 17 acres of Eurasian water milfoil, which is a notorious aquatic weed invader. And you can see these lines here, the colors are a GIS layout of bottom barriers that we deploy to kill them, essentially. They're blocking sunlight, stopping photosynthesis, and killing these plants. So that 17 acres of bottom barriers were installed in 2020, 21, 22 timeframe. And we're looking now to remove them hopefully this season, but potentially next season. So what's really interesting about this location as well is once this becomes like it's fully functioning, once it becomes fully functioning, it has a potential to provide habitat for every single native species in the basin. So that's really important and really pretty cool. So this is an aerial view of all the bottom barriers that were installed. This is during low water, so you can really see all the black and the lines you see, those are all bottom barriers. And right now, this works. But on the mouth side, we're getting a lot of high flows of water coming through with the winters that we've had in the recent years. So sediment is building on top of those. So we're removing some of those now as we speak, and hand pulling will go on while these other barriers are remaining in place. And divers have done extensive surveys upstream to make sure that the weeds have not grown further upstream because it can be transported by waterfowl and wind, a lot of wind action up here. So all negative upstream, so that's really good news. And now, after they remove these sediment-covered barriers, they're going to start looking under the barriers to see if those root structures are dead. And if they are, then we'll start facilitating the removal. And then the next step, the Forest Service will be doing a full-scale restoration of the rest of the site. A cool aspect of this project, too, if you've heard of Tahoe yellowcrest, it's an endemic species only found here in Lake Tahoe. Hundreds of little plants were discovered when they were doing the installation of these bottom barriers. And because they're such a rare species, partners got together to form a conservation plan, which prevented them from becoming an endangered species. And so once these were discovered, the conservation plan kicked in, and I think 1,500 plants were translocated with over a 90% success rate of survival, which is really kind of unheard of. So it's a pretty cool effort. So you can see the plant here on the left. In that upper picture on the right, there's a Forest Service staff, seasonal staff that are doing those transplanting, and then some of the kind of natural deterrents that were put out to prevent people from impeding in those areas. But the project, as I mentioned, is going through surveys, so lots of surveys in the wintertime during high flows, or springtime, I should say, to make sure those barriers were remaining intact, and now doing those efficacy surveys under the barriers to see if we're ready to remove them. This is an example, this blue outline area, that's the area of the high water flows where we're getting sediment, so that's where some of the barriers are being removed right now. And this is what it really should look like. As I mentioned, the beauty of it really rivals this ecological significance of this location. So it's a lot of work. We've got a lot of work to do just overall with the program. It's a lot of challenges, a lot of successes that we've learned along the way to get to the point where we're able to tackle projects like this. As Amy mentioned, it's the largest project we have going. Previously it was about 6 acres, now we're at 17. So taking those lessons learned and scaling up as we go. Thank you.
If you have questions, I think we're trying to pass around note cards in the dark. So raise your hand and Noah will come find you and give you a note card, and then we'll do questions after. Kevin, I think if I get this. Right. As you can tell, one of the best parts of my job, and really everybody who works at the Tahoe Fund, is that we get to work with the most incredible partners. Everything that we do at the Tahoe Fund is a partnership, and you're going to see that on display today. So Dennis, thank you so much for taking us through that. We're really excited to invite Kevin Pryor to join us now, Director of the Land Division at the California Tahoe Conservancy. We were absolutely thrilled to work with Kevin and his team to help them acquire the former Motel 6 property in South Lake Tahoe, the highest priority acquisition project in Tahoe for decades. I think my first day on the job, someone asked me, are you going to help us buy former Motel 6? So first I have to figure out where my email is, but then we'll get going on it. And fast forward this March, the Conservancy, with support from the TRPA, the League to Save Lake Tahoe, the Tahoe Fund, and some others, were finally able to acquire this property. So Kevin's going to share with us what happens now and why this is such a critical piece of lake clarity and lake water quality for Tahoe.
All right, can you guys hear me? Thanks. Good to be here. Thanks, Amy. My name is Kevin Pryor. I'm the Director of the Land Division at the California Tahoe Conservancy. And I'm here today to talk to you about our acquisition of Motel 6. Motel 6, or better known as the Motel 6 in Knox Johnson property, is located on the south shore of Lake Tahoe. And it's a 31-acre property located in the city limits of the city of South Lake Tahoe. This picture here I wanted to bring up to you to show you kind of the significance of the property and where it's located. Before I go into why this is such an important property, I wanted to highlight a little bit of how we came to acquire this property. And I think it's important. I don't normally talk about the acquisition process and how we came to acquire property because it's fairly dry. But in this case, I think it's important to highlight the partnerships that Amy was talking about as far as the acquisition of this property. It's important to recognize the California Tahoe Conservancy. We're a very large land organization or land owning organization in the California or in the basin. And our focus since 1984 has mostly been around undeveloped open space property. But as we look forward into what's really needed to acquire and protect Lake Tahoe, we know that a lot of the remaining properties are developed. And to go after an acquisition such as this one, where it's 140 unit property with a restaurant, has a house on it, it's a very difficult and long process that requires, quite frankly, I think what we call Team Tahoe to come up with it and really make it happen. And those partnerships are critical to make something like this happen. We need a Tahoe Regional Planning Agency to help provide funding. We needed various state grantors to help us with it. And I just want to highlight with the Tahoe Fund, this property probably wouldn't have happened, our acquisition wouldn't have happened unless we leveraged the strengths of the Tahoe Fund and the Conservancy together and really kind of was able to provide two offers to the landowners who were interested in selling to us, but they had a lot of competing priorities as far as who was interested in the property. But through that partnership with the Tahoe Fund, we were successful in acquiring the property. And that's no small feat. And I can look across the West at various properties and even past acquisitions where the go-it-alone kind of business model that the Conservancy and other state and national organizations have used isn't always as successful. So we're seeing kind of leveraging nonprofits and really kind of combining our efforts together to be successful in these acquisitions of these much more developed properties that are, quite frankly, a lot harder to acquire. So I do feel like that's the future of acquisitions, and securing properties such as this Motel 6 here is how we're going to deliver on that environmental gain on the ground. Now, let me just talk a little bit about why this property is so important to us in Lake Tahoe. And I think this property in this picture kind of, to me, speaks two things. The first is, it's obvious that Motel 6, which is in the bottom, right in the middle of the property here, the two buildings, I think you can tell that it's basically sticking right out into the meadow. And it's sitting on 8 feet of fill. It was built in 1974 before a lot of these protections were in place. And the second thing that this picture does for me, it shows the scale of the acquisition and the watershed itself. So if you look up in the top right-hand corner, you're kind of looking up at Carson Pass and East Meadow. It gives you a sense of the watershed that drains through the south shore of Lake Tahoe, through the Johnson Meadow property, which is on the other side of Highway 50 there, and then through Motel 6. And I should note that the Johnson Meadow property is another property that, through the partnership with Tahoe Fund and other funders, we were able to acquire. Tahoe Resource Conservation District owns that one. But it's important to note, that the sheer scale of that acquisition and that watershed are important as we kind of look forward into what are kind of the severe impacts on the basin. And that brings me to climate change. And you'll hear tonight around why we're seeing a lot of external factors and what those effects are on the Lake Tahoe Basin and the lake itself. But when you acquire and are able to secure public ownership of essentially the 9 lower miles of the Upper Truckee River, you can really see landscape scale restoration projects that have true benefits to the lake and to lake clarity. This next slide kind of gives you a feel for, now we're looking north towards Lake Tahoe and the Upper Truckee Marsh. And this area is where you can kind of also get a sense of how Motel 6 fits squarely within that meadow. It's also important to note that we were able to acquire not just the 4 acres of the motel site there, but we also were able to acquire approximately 27 acres behind it. So that's going to allow us to really see those benefits of future restoration projects and the ones that we've already completed. This next slide is kind of, as we move down the river corridor and closer to the lake, this is another property the Conservancy owns, which is the Upper Truckee Marsh. And there's kind of 2 things at this slide that I think are kind of important to note to me as kind of a layperson on this. The first is it kind of gives you a sense of the type of restoration projects you can expect to see in the Lake Tahoe Basin, especially in future when we get a hold of additional funding for the restoration of Motel 6. The second part of this is just the interesting fact of the science that's going on behind carbon sequestration in the meadows and marshes. This is a scientist from UNR who is doing monitoring of the carbon sequestration of the marshes in the Lake in the Upper Truckee Marsh, and we're finding that carbon sequestration is much greater than even the forestry projects that we're doing, and even sometimes the tropical rainforest down in South America. And that's a pretty significant thing, is when you're looking at the future around climate change and the needs for carbon sequestration. My last slide is a little bit more on the wildlife and wildlife habitat around these areas. What really strikes me about South Lake Tahoe and the areas around South Lake Tahoe are the marshes and meadows. Kind of a little secret, I guess, for locals that, what really attracts me to all the different really beautiful places, especially around the South Shore, are all the meadows. Well, what we're learning about those meadows is not only the benefits to water quality, but the wildlife habitat that we're seeing there. We know that these wildlife habitats create great corridors for the movement of large species such as bears and mountain lion and bobcats. It's also bringing back some of those, I don't know if they're really interesting species, such as the sandhill crane and other. I'm drawing a blank on the other bird, but sorry. But so we're seeing a lot of that return of those key species, and that's really something that's beneficial, I think, for the meadows and the movement and the biodiversity that we're seeing on the South Shore and within Lake Tahoe. So that's the end of my slides. I hope you found it interesting, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And just to let everybody know, so now that it's been acquired, the next phase is tearing it down. So we're partnering with the Conservancy. We have a $200,000 campaign running right now to raise the money to help them tear that down. And then the next phase will be restoring the wetlands. So hopefully we'll all look as beautiful as this, and the sand cranes will return to everything. Thank you. Okay, now we're going to transition into our panel. And so I would love to invite our panelists to come up. We're joined by Dr. Sudeep Chandra, Director of the Ozmen Institute for Global Studies, Director of the Global Water Center, and Professor of the University of Nevada, Reno. Dan Segan, Chief Science and Policy Advisor at the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, and Dr. Alex Forrest, Interim Director of the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center and Associate Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering. And this is my glass of can of water. I don't want to be drinking it all the way. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. This is really special. It's quite the dream team we have going. I want to start with the annual State of the Lake report. It was released about 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's something that UC Davis puts out every year for how many years, Alex?
Since 2008.
2008. Okay. And within that is also our lake clarity numbers, and probably you saw the headlines for this. It's always best to look at trends, not yearly data points, but let me share a few of the yearly data points, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So for 2003, so it's 2004, but the report is actually for last year's data. There were 3 big numbers. The average annual clarity was 68.2 feet. The average winter clarity was one of the highest ever recorded, 91.8 feet. And the average summer clarity was also one of record setting, but in the other direction, 53.5 feet. So almost a 40-foot swing between winter and summer numbers. So without getting too focused on individual numbers in this year, because trends are really what's most important, can you tell us, where do these numbers come from and what do they mean?
Sure. So let's start with something to you and everyone having this here. And I think the first thing is there we go. People hear me. What is affecting this measurement? And so what it is a measurement of lake clarity. And basically, it's technology circa late 1800s, where basically we take a plate, it's a 10-inch white disc that we lower into the water, and when it disappears from sight, that's when we record the light level, or the level at which we can see. And these measurements we've been tracking in the lake since 1968. And so we have a long-term record that we use to interpret how changes in clarity are happening in the lake. And so the numbers that Amy brought up are part of this long-term trend and long-term observations that we have as part of our longer-term monitoring program that measure many other parameters. And this year, I think it's about 2 feet different from last year. I think the annual average. And so we're basically looked like a flat line, and which is relatively good news. That is not too much worse or too much better than the year before. But if we start decomposing it into winter and summer, when you take the winter values, we're actually representing the 10th best on record and the best since 1983. And so that's a really good improvement and represents the dynamics of the lake and the mixing of the lake that happens during the winter. But then if you look at the summertime conditions, it's actually the 5th worst that we have on record. And so this is part of a longer term trend where if you're averaging the summer and winter together, you're basically getting a flat line. But if you start looking at just the summer, we're still on a linear trend where the conditions are getting worse too. And that's where a lot of our research is looking at, is trying to understand the longer term trends. And we've been exploring the impacts of climate change and broader regional scale changes that can happen to the lake that can drive clarity during the summer.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else want to add anything? Sudeep, Dan?
Yeah, I'll just emphasize, I think it's important to these individual, you've heard this just a moment ago, but just to emphasize it, it's understanding the trend or the long-term change is something we want to make policy around rather than just individual data points. Kind of like when you have a headache, you know, you might have a headache during the week, maybe you have a migraine because you work too much or the kids are screaming or something's happening. Your long-term pulse is okay. And so I just want to de-emphasize a little bit of the swinging so much as I do want to understand the winter time periods versus summer and what this long pulse is doing. And I think that's what the Science Advisory Council that we have together with UC Davis and others are really fixating more on what that pulse is going to be rather than this individual year.
Dan, anything to add? So in terms of ultimate goals for the lake, is there a number that we're trying to get to?
I'm going to let Dan take that one first.
Did I get a chance to talk? Excellent. So our long-term goal is to restore the clarity of the lake back to what you could see in the late 60s. So we're looking at targeting about 100 feet of clarity. That's our long-term goal. Alex sort of touched on it. So UC Davis has been taking these measurements just about every 2 weeks for the better part of the last 50 years. And we know, so clarity initially was declining at about a foot a year. So between the late 70s and about 2000, we were losing a foot of clarity every year. And since then, it's stabilized at around 70 feet. And we've seen it more or less in that range for the better part of the last 25 years.
Yeah, great. So the next follow-up question was going to be, are we on the right track to get there? But I think you answered that, Dan. Thing. We're seeing it trending.
Yeah, I think so. I'd say yes, but with a caveat. So I think we've seen positive impacts of the work that we've done. So when we initially developed the plan, we worked with the same scientists that I'm sitting with right now. It's called the Lake Tahoe Total Maximum Daily Load. And we estimated that we'd have to prevent 65% of the pollutants from reaching the lake. And it's a long-term plan to achieve that. So we've set a number of milestones along the way to assess our progress on how we're doing. And we're nearing the first of those major milestones, which is 78 feet of clarity in 2031. And as Alex and Sudeep both said, we don't really pay attention to the annual measurement all that much. What we're looking at is the 5-year average clarity. Because we know that clarity varies measurement to measurement, year to year. It's totally normal for it to go up 5 feet, down 5 feet. That's nothing that anyone on the stage here celebrates or gets overly depressed about. But we really are looking at those long-term trends. And so a lot of what we look back to is forecasts that were made at the time the TMDL was developed. And what those forecasts tell us is that had we not done anything at that time, had we just continued on the course we were going, that we would be at about 19 meters of clarity today. So we'd be looking at about 62 feet, about 6 to 10 feet worse than where we are right now. And the goal is, as Amy asked, the goal is really to actually start to see improved clarity over the next 5 and 10 years. And that's what we're hoping to see.
Alex, you briefly mentioned, but if I could ask you to dive a little bit deeper. Can you tell us, you mentioned that the lake was mixing. Can you explain what that means and what the impacts are?
Sure. So in a lake, there's an annual stratification process where during the summer you start adding heat from the sun, and you'll start heating up the top layer of the water. And that top layer is less dense than the water beneath, and so the water beneath is cold. So if anybody's ever gone swimming and dove in early spring, when it's hot at the top and cold at the bottom, that's you diving through that thermocline. And so long term, there is a thermal inertia to a lake. So when you go through your summer and fall, there's a resistance to mixing that water from up top to water beneath. And when we get these deep water mixing events that are critical for the health of the lake, they tend to happen in winter during deep water mixing events. And during these winter deep water mixing events, what you get is a strong storm come in, generally during a cold spell that triggers a deep water mixing event that is bringing nutrients up from the bottom and you're taking oxygen down from the top. And so this is part of the natural cycle, but the water that's coming up from the bottom is very, tends to be clearer. And so it's mixing that water around, redistributing that water. So it's part of that natural cycle that's helping the clarity of the lake, but also helping the health, where it's restoring the oxygen and it's also bringing the nutrients up that then gets used in the next cycle.
Right. And we did mix in winter of 2023.
2023 we mixed, 2019 we mixed, 2017 we got close, 2011. You're starting to notice a trend here that it's for all the skiers in the room, that it's all of the big snow years that we've had over the past 15 years. Generally the times that we get these big deep water mixing events. And so as we start looking at forecast models in the future, where we're having less snow during the winter, or we're having less big winters, then these are winters where we may not have these deep water mixing events. And maybe shifting the balance of what's happening in the lake.
Right, thank you. Anyone else have anything to add on the mixing? Okay, so we've spent a lot of time talking about lake clarity as it relates to the Secchi disk, which happens kind of in the middle of the lake where it is very, very deep. What is happening at the shoreline, or what some folks call the near shore?
You want to try that one first?
Yeah, maybe I'll just step back and I'll talk about the nearshore, I promise. So when I think about a lake and how it functions, I'll think about, and I'll relate it to myself, I'll think about the heart, which is the landscape. And so the landscape, we have a lot of activities that you just listened to about trying to protect the meadows and reduce the nutrients and stuff coming to the lake. I think about the lungs. The lungs are the bottom of the lake, including the nearshore. So it's the bottom, not just the water column. And the bottom of the lake, the lungs, process the stuff that comes from the watershed. Then you've got the brain, which is the center of the lake. It's really receiving all that pumping action of blood and energy, and it's responsive. You're seeing changes in clarity there. But then you've got kidneys, which is kind of the air shed, and maybe the climate feeds back this whole circulatory system in our process. And the reason I'm sharing those 4 components is the nearshore change that we see. So the nearshore, including the bottom, the lungs, are in this really precarious position. Not terrible. Definitely receiving things from the watershed, the stuff that we're controlling from the watershed right now and improving the meadows so that we reduce the nutrients coming to the bottom and the lungs. But there are those invasive species that we see. The good news is that we have a pretty good handle on what Dennis just mentioned on the type of species that we have in the lake and where we should control or prioritize at least the plants, for example. But then we have these new invaders, like the mudsnail. We're not quite sure what the mudsnail could do for water quality. We suspect it might do something akin to what the clams are doing that are already in the lake, that they recycle nutrients to allow algae to grow. They grow algae, basically, to create the perfect miracle growth. And so the nearshore bottom is changing not only from its biological composition, but there's reports from our community, some of you in here, that parts of the nearshore are having a little more green activity than maybe there used to be. And so this would be a question I'd actually pose back to the audience, is to tell us what you think is happening in the nearshore in terms of color or greenness of the area. But I think the nearshore is this new novel frontier for both the scientists in here and the managers. We know some of the invasives are there. We know we need to control them because they can affect the water quality. We have a couple new invasives we should probably worry about. But the take-home message is the nearshores, the lungs, are in a bit of a more delicate position right now. The science hasn't necessarily focused on changes in the nearshore in an integrative way, where we're understanding climate and the landscape. And so that's a new novel area for us. And so I want to emphasize that we have a science advisory council right now made up of colleagues from Davis and USGS, and that's a new topical area for us. We're going to put a lot of energy in 2025 on understanding changes in the nearshore. So in summary from my side, when I think about the nearshore, I'm now starting to think about all of those other interactions and thinking about kind of where stuff's going to turn green and why in other parts of the lake is it not.
I would be remiss if I didn't give Alex a chance to tout your citizen science app.
But or specifically Heather's citizen science app. But so Sudeep was talking about the greenness, and sometimes you feel the nearshore might be greener than it was. And so UC Davis has developed a citizen science app, and I encourage folks to go to tahoe.ucdavis.edu to download that app. And when you see locations around the lakes, document it, to document the algae that's growing in the nearshore and the color, the fabric, et cetera, to try to understand and feed that information back to us to try to help us understand locations where we're getting these sites. The other thing, and Sudeep was alluding to this as well, is the connectivity between the nearshore and what we call the pelagic zone of the lake, so the deep region of the lake. And there is a balance to that. And so for those in the room that know the winds on Tahoe and know how the winds come up every afternoon and basically blow offshore, but then by early evening are blowing back onshore, there is a natural dynamic that's blowing water back and forth from the nearshore to the offshore and then back again. So from that nearshore to the pelagic. And so that's also part of what we try to understand, where we actually have a real-time network of instrumentation around the lake that we can actually go as scientists, and we can actually go as citizens and download the data and try to understand that and see that data happening in real time. And so that helps us as scientists, but it also helps us as citizens trying to understand the dynamics of the lake and whether or not you're a paddle boarder or a sailor or a motorboater or a swimmer, that you're able to participate in the science and kind of be part of the story as well.
Dan, anything to add?
Just to close it out, I think, because we often get the question, why do we only hear about clarity in the middle of the lake, and aren't you doing something about our beaches? And I think we've actually had a real sea change within both the science and management community over the last 15 years. And we now invest more in nearshore monitoring programs than we actually do in deep lake monitoring programs. So we do annual surveys around the entire lake for aquatic invasive species of the type that Dennis talked about. These are aquatic invasive plants. UC Davis has an extensive algae monitoring program that they implement for us that dates back to 1980. We recently updated that because there's a new type of algae that we're seeing. That's the free-floating algae that you may have noticed that Sudeep referenced. Sudeep's lab actually does sampling for E. coli to ensure the safety of our beaches for for human recreation. And I think it's as a result of that, and Sudeep mentioned it earlier, the science community. So when we first started to notice the metaphyte, the green, like the really bright green gross algae that you've probably noticed some places around the lake, we went to our science partners at the Science Advisory Council and said, hey, what's going on? And one of the really great things that you have when you have a science council you can tap into is they all have networks of other individuals around the world. And Sudeep led a workshop that brought together, I feel weird talking about Sudeep's science sitting next to him. But yeah, I'll just take credit for his stuff. But they brought all these scientists together from around the world, and many other scientists were observing the same phenomenon. And they wrote a great paper called Blue Lakes, Green Bottoms, where they were seeing this similar trend that in otherwise what we think of as healthy, clear lakes, we're starting to see this nearshore greening phenomenon.
I'll just point out those lakes include, some of you have referenced, Lake Baikal, the lake in Russia. Well, that lake turns out has clear open water and it's got a green bottom. Crater Lake in Oregon 3 years ago had a fairly large algal bloom in the edge and bottom. I'm sharing this with you because it means our story, we're not alone. That means we can tap into other scientists and managers working in other systems to decide, okay, well, help us figure out what's happening here. We'll help you figure out what's happening there. How much of it is climate related, where we can't do anything, versus how much might be landscape related, which is something we can do, is restore our meadows and restore our creek.
Right. You've touched on it a little bit, but let's get a little bit more into the details. So we lost a foot of clarity every year. Now we're starting to climb back. And for those of you that don't know, it's fine sediment flowing into the lake that occludes lake clarity. That's the real issue. So we know that about 70% of that fine sediment is coming from urban areas. Can you talk a little bit about what those challenges are? How is it getting from the urban areas into the lake? How are we preventing it from getting into the lake? What are the challenges there?
So Amy had it right. 70% of the fine sediment that clouds our lake comes from our urban areas. And when we say urban areas, we mean our streets, we mean our backyards, we mean everything that you see developed and paved around you. What are fine sediments? So they are very small particles, likely inorganic particles. We think inorganics account for about 70% of clarity loss. Then the 30% is organic particles, that's live algae in the lake. And how do we reduce fine sediment particles? So I mentioned earlier the TMDL was a 65-year plan to reduce fine sediment particle pollution reaching the lake. And we do that by preventing runoff from coming straight from our urbanized areas and flowing straight into our lake. So if you have a home in Tahoe, you have BMPs around your home, which are, it's probably annoying. You come to my agency, you're annoyed, you have to spend a little extra money. But the little extra money that each of us spend, that helps water infiltrate on your property itself and not become runoff on the street where it mobilizes other sediments and goes down into the lake. And one of the best things that we can do is we infiltrate water, then both the nutrients in that and the fine sediment particles are entrained in the soil and they don't reach our lake. So we do those EMPs that you do your parcel level on a much larger scale for neighborhoods. So we have large scale community treatments that function effectively the same way. They are capturing that dirty stormwater, preventing it from running directly into the lake, and letting the nutrients and sediments settle out. Before I yield it to either of the two gentlemen on the side of me, I think the other thing is we're also trying to restore nature's filtration system. So Kevin talked a lot about the Motel 6 acquisition. And one of the natural roles that our wetlands played in the region is they were our natural filtration system. We have these large runoff events, and historically when those rivers were not developed and the floodplain didn't have development in them, the banks of the river would overflow, the sediment would be deposited all over the floodplain, and you'd get much clearer water reaching the lake. And so projects like the Motel 6 acquisition and restoration restore the natural filtration systems within our region and mean that it's less work for ourselves and you all in the room to do to clean up the lake on its behalf.
So I might just build a bit more on what a fine particle is. And so when we think of sediment and sand in the water, those are types of particles that we can see. Now, most of the particles that affect clarity, that affect how we can see through the water, the optical properties of the water, are fine particles, which are in the range of about 1 to 6 micron, or micrometer, which is about the width of a human hair. So very, very fine particles. And so one of the things that we're doing at UC Davis is trying to understand the processes by which these fine particles are actually removed from the water, and trying to understand the mechanisms of what's called aggregation, basically how these particles are bound together and then drop out of suspension. And so this was actually building on work that we did together from the Caldor Fire, where particles are being deposited from the sky onto the water, and we could see that impact almost right away. But then what was most astounding to us was as soon as the fires stopped, we saw those particles disappear. And settle out of water way faster than we ever expected. So that's one of the ongoing questions is what are the mechanisms, the natural mechanisms that remove those particles from the water and take it out of suspension? Because maintaining that functionality will be critical for preserving clarity longer term in the future.
I'm just going to add one nerdy part to this that I hope there are nerds out there. How many of you like your bacteria and probiotics? Yes, many of you. It turns out lakes have probiotics too. It's bacteria that might be aggregating these sediments and then dropping them out. Yet the investment around bacteria and science in lakes is very low, mostly done in oceans. And so this is an area where the Science Council that we have said that, and the consultants we had just gave us some feedback saying, hey, why don't you try to understand the settling of the particles? UC Davis is interested, and the scientists at University of Nevada are, but you should probably look at the bacterial community. So this is a kind of an exciting, fun area of investment to look at our lake's probiotics and see what happens with the settling of the particles.
Right. I think something that's been in the media a lot that I would love to have you talk about is microplastics. So Tahoe has microplastics, we know. If you can talk a little bit about what size are those microplastics? Do we know where they're coming from? I know there are pristine alpine lakes with absolutely zero visitation that also have microplastics. So it's very complicated. I'm sorry that our folks at DRI who are really focused on this weren't able to join us tonight. But if somebody can tell us more about microplastics.
Okay, I'll start it. I'll let Sudeep keep going. So I guess, first of all, we should talk about what microplastics are. Because commonly in the news, when we think about microplastics, we have these images in our heads of handfuls of plastic. And that's certainly part of the story because big plastic makes little plastic and so on down. And one of the studies that we have done, and our colleagues at DRI have done a lot of work here, have been around larger size plastics. And so the measurements that we have done to date are around 335 microns. So half the size of a grain, well, a couple of grains of sand is sort of the size that we're talking about. And when we start thinking about the optical properties of water and get down to those fine particles again, where it's down in the size of the width of a human hair, we are lacking the tools to even get there, to really understand what those particles are. But we know those particles are coming into our lakes, like our pristine alpine lakes. There was actually just a Nature paper that was published about 2 months ago where they found microplastics in snow in Antarctica. So we are seeing it is becoming ubiquitous in our environment. And so we really have to make sure we classify what size particles we're talking about when we talk about microplastics, and then how do we characterize them, and what tools we can use to characterize them to find out the sources of where they are coming from. And you want to keep going from there?
Yeah, I might step back just a moment and rather call it microplastics. I might just talk about plastics. That way we don't have to get into the nitty gritty if something's the size of your hair versus maybe end of your fingernail or something. And the reason is I think we can all agree that we'd like to minimize the plastics that are in water. And so what the science community is doing now across, you have some of the best experts in this region actually on studying plastics in water, is we're just trying to understand how many plastics are in water, where they're coming from. We don't quite have an idea. We have hypotheses or suggestions, if it's not confirmed, like maybe smoke from wildfires might be carrying plastics from burning structure over. Perhaps drier events are moving things over onto the airshed. Some of the bigger plastics that we see on beaches, maybe they're degrading. And so these are all suggestions. They're not definitive, but we could use some common sense here related to plastics. So things we could do, use less plastic. I mean, that's something you can do as an actionable item. When we get to our beaches or we're walking on the roads, pick up the plastic that someone has left, and then try to encourage, as I believe the agencies are now really doing this, along with the Tahoe Fund and the League to Save Lake Tahoe, is use plastic responsibly and put your trash away where it should go. And then lastly, if you could give us a little bit of time as scientists to figure out what's happening with plastics in the water. That's where we are related to the science. It's just trying to determine where in the water column the plastics are. Do they play a role in controlling any of the clarity? We don't think so, but we're not 100% sure. And then what the ecological effects could be. We do think that bigger plastics that get put into water affect the oxygen and nutrient concentration. And so we have some studies. So you're going to have to bear with some of the science, as this is pretty novel for us. Not just in the region, but globally studying plastics. So I just want to emphasize, this is actually something you can take care of easily on your lawns, on your landscapes, within your personal habits, and this is something that would help us solve this issue faster than anything.
Tangential to microplastics, but I know there was some research done in the ocean that showed microplastics were coming from tires, because tires are worn down over time, then they're flowing into the ocean. So a question that's come up in the past when we talk about sources flowing into the lake and fine sediment is that there seems to be a correlation between a very big winter and terrible summer clarity. And the question is it because everything's flowing so quickly through the streams, or is it possible that we have to put so much material down on the roads to keep people safe during big winters that material is making its way into the lake?
Yes. It's definitely possible that's happening, along with the wearing of the rubber on your tires. That has been implicated with great scientists out of University of Washington showing that perhaps the decline in salmon are due to the result of tire wear, and the wearing of that tire has certain chemicals and it gets put into the water and things like that. But do we know that's happening in Tahoe? I think that research is pending right now and people are actively working on it across both U.S. federal agencies and some academic institutes. But your observation is correct. When we have these high water years or snowpack years, we put material down and that schmutz probably gets into the lake. And one thing we've observed recently from a Science Advisory Council review of the clarity is that we see some bumps in the clarity over time. The particle concentration. And we've utilized the data from UC Davis, our colleagues at USGS, and you can see this kind of threshold change. And we're not sure why that's happening, but one of the things we suspect, again, a hypothesis or a question the scientists are trying to figure out is maybe it's because of road material. Dan, you want to answer that one? That's a hot seat question.
I was just going to build off of the observation because some of the science that went into the development of the TMDL basically pointed us to exactly what Amy referenced. Traction abrasives being a large source of particles going to the lake, and on the order of 10 times the concentration of fine sediments from winter runoff as we see in summer runoff. And so a huge focus of road maintenance and road management in Tahoe over the past 15 years has been applying fewer abrasives, and I think we're roughly on a quarter of what we used to apply, and then recovery of those abrasives that we do apply on the roads. You've probably noticed throughout the region, after a storm goes through, you've seen those abrasives applied. You're also seeing street sweepers work throughout the region, and the role that those street sweepers play is they're trying to recover all of that material that's applied to the roads before it can reach the lake and impair clarity.
And then I'm going to add to this by just talking about the lake itself again. And one of the issues with the lake that we have is we have a very small watershed versus a very deep. And what that translates into is that the water that we put in there residence time or the amount of time that that water spends in the lake is very long compared to other lakes and other watersheds. So the general amount of time that a single packet of water will spend in the lake is about 650 years. So basically it's a concentrator because of the natural balance, this natural exchange between the watershed and the lake. It will then concentrate things that we put in. So we have to make sure that we don't put them in. And then once it's in there, it will then affect the balance and overall concentration. And so that's something that we have to think about in terms of this balance and how we flush the lake.
Right. So we touched on this a little bit, but I would love for you to expound a bit on what, so much time and energy and money goes into reducing what flows into Lake Tahoe and improving lake clarity. We touched on some of the tools, but if you could expand on what tools are we using the most of? What do we think are the most effective?
Us, the brains of scientists. I just can't underemphasize that. We travel and work on conservation projects and engineering projects around the globe for large lakes. There are not, in these other systems, there are not a concentrate. There hasn't been a concentration scientist that I've observed working on an issue. And so I know it sounds a bit silly, like we jump to technology really quickly. In your backyard right here, you have at least 6 research and science institutions working on activities and a bunch of consultants. You should really hug your scientists the next time you see them. The technologies we can use that we're utilizing, I think, are unique. Also, we have some of the best science that's using remote sensing of trying to understand fire, smoke behavior, skin temperatures of water, so on and so forth from satellite. We have instruments within water that UC Davis has, the USGS, federal agency, University of Nevada, that are sensing the lake at scales of time that are just a few minutes or seconds. That's something we didn't have 10 or 15 years ago. We've really upgraded our tool. We still have many more things to do, I think. And then, like, you have an underwater submarine, a missile that shoots around in the lake and measures the properties of the water. How cool is it? And then lastly, I think what we have that going for us here compared to the other large lakes around the globe that we've been studying, whether Italy or Mongolia or Guatemala, it's basically we have people who are making observations. This is really, really important for us. Whenever you all see something, rather than panic, it's really important for you to report it so we can try to understand whether that's an issue that we need to study immediately or maybe it's down on the back burner. And so I can't overemphasize. We need more citizen science observation, is what I'm suggesting. And so that app is really helpful as well.
Just double down on Sudeep's Hug a Scientist and just highlight one foundational piece of research that dates back 15 years ago now, and it's called the Pollutant Load Reduction Opportunity Report. And basically a group of scientists got together and had a what if list. Like, what if we stopped driving? What if everyone doubled the size of their BNP? And they evaluated not only the efficacy of each of these things, but also the cost. And then the things that rose to the top that were the most pollutant load reduction for the lowest cost are the things that we and our partners are implementing today. So those are the foundational management actions that we're taking. The only other thing I would add to that is I think when we talk about Tahoe, I think we sometimes lose the global perspective that Sudeep's talking about. And we think, oh man, we're spending so much money here. But I think when you put Tahoe in the scale of other large-scale ecological restoration efforts, like this is an expensive business. We've spent $1.5 billion on restoring Tahoe's clarity in the last 20-some years. The Chesapeake Bay spent $2.2 billion last year trying to reduce pollutant load. The Everglades will spend more than that this year. So these projects that we're undertaking, these are big projects. And they are expensive and they take lots of time and determination and effort.
And I would add to that they're also not static. So it is a constantly evolving front where the entire ecosystem is evolving, our The dynamics of the lake are changing, and they're changing in response to not just our influence, but also regional climate change. So climate change is shifting the overall condition of the lake, shifting the dynamics of the ecosystem. And so we need to continue to evolve new tools in order to understand the problem, but also continue to understand how it's changing. And so it's the efforts of the scientists, of the citizens, and it's the passion of the people that live here that continue to engage with it, that make this such a unique place to try to protect.
Right. I want to just give a plug. I don't think a lot of people realize, but the East Shore Trail, it gets a lot of kudos for the safety improvements and obviously the recreation amenity. It's also an enormous stormwater management project as well. The parking lots have pavers that capture, they have vaults underneath the pavers that capture a lot of sediment that flows in. Before that project was put in, there were never curbs and gutters on 28, and now there are. So there's a lot of ways where you might not recognize, but pretty much every project that happens in Tahoe has a fine sediment reducing or stormwater management component. Right. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but I'm sure many of you saw, I think it was around July 4th, there was a crazy viral TikTok video with a woman who claimed her dog died of an algal bloom in Lake Tahoe, a toxic algal bloom. So I was hoping somebody could tell us, what are algal blooms? What does that mean? And what did we learn from that experience?
I'll start it off. Okay, so, right, there are plants in water. There's either good plants or bad plants. And the harmful algal blooms that we see are generally comprised of a certain type of plant we call cyanobacteria. Now, it's easy to get mad at cyanobacteria because they're harmful and they're potentially creating poisons in the water. I'm going to do a shout out like I do in my basic biology class to cyanobacteria, because over 4 billion years ago, the reason we have oxygen in the atmosphere is because cyanobacteria evolved to use the sun's energy of light to produce oxygen, and use that carbon dioxide. So not all cyanobacteria are bad, but there are bad ones around, and they're happening. They're everywhere. If you look at the corner of your bathtub, I guarantee you there's a cyanobacteria. If you look at your hot tub, there's a cyanobacteria there. In these lakes, what I worry about, and I think what others are worried about, is this balance of the amount of cyanobacteria we have in the water getting out of balance, and it's causing us some issues here. So some previous studies that were done show that Lake Tahoe streams has some of the highest concentrations of cyanotoxins than anywhere else in the Sierra, and that was done about 5 or 7 years ago. Is that a fault of the agencies? Probably not, right? It's not, these watersheds aren't disturbed heavily, it's the climate is changing, and the streams are processing slower, they have slower water and warmer temperatures. That's what cyanobacteria love. And so we can take that type of story and then apply it to the lake. In the edge of the lake where there's less mixing, the water temperatures are warm, so someone like me can actually go swimming because I like warm water. It's likely that you're going to select for cyanobacteria. And this is not for any fault, I don't think, just yet, from any agencies or any groups. This is just the nature of the shifting climate. And that's why we're putting a lot more attention to it. So one thing I'll add is, I was talking to my colleague at the University of Nevada who gets excited about cyanobacteria and toxins. He's wonderful. And she and I were talking, and it made me realize that, you know, sometimes we can't detect the cyanotoxins that come from bacteria in the water. That's something that the science hasn't caught up to. The concentrations are pretty low. But what we do know is when there's algal mats, when there's actually a lot of algae growing off the bottom, and if it contains cyanobacteria, you don't want your dog in that mat or drinking the water in that area. So you can do things that are quite good for you and your animals. Just use your common sense and visuals. You see flowing water, good. But if you see mats of algae, don't have your animals go in there. Don't have them even walk in there, partly because they might lick their paws or something. So I don't think this is a Tahoe-only problem. I think this is a common problem we're facing in the western U.S. Many others are thinking that. Downstream, I know our colleagues at the Paiute tribe at Pyramid Lake have been concerned about cyanobacteria. So I'll leave it there. I'm not saying to hug a cyanobacteria, but be aware that it's all around and it's the reason you have oxygen on the planet today.
So you touched on this with detection of cyanobacteria, detection of toxin. So there are a variety of different toxins, microsystems, one of those, hepatotoxins, neurotoxins. These are very, very rare, and particularly in lake systems. And so it's an interesting messaging piece where when you look and see algae on the surface, that's not necessarily bad. And the ones that are toxin producing are very hard to see, and they're very hard to detect, both whether or not you go collect samples or whether or not you tend to detect them from space, which is really the holy grail of remote sensing. Where remote sensing, we can look at blooms on the surface of the water, but to actually detect the toxicity of it, that is something that we as a global community are really trying to get to, where we can detect that toxicity from space to then do alert systems. And that's one of the things that agencies and managers are really working across the state to be able to put up warning signs so that we are able to do early detection and then prevention of exposure. And so that's one of the things that came out of that viral TikTok video was the warning system that went up right away. And maybe Dan can talk to that a bit more.
Maybe just to close it out, I think as managers, the things that we are most concerned with related to HABs really are the areas where we're most likely to see HABs, and that's not in Tahoe itself. As Sudeep and Alex both said, they are most likely to form in slow, stagnant, nutrient-rich waters. So you're thinking what we worry about is backwater areas more disconnected from main channels or the main lake, where you're more likely to see those conditions occur. The agencies do sample regularly at many of our beaches to see if there are detectable levels of cyanotoxins. Usually there usually are not in Tahoe itself. In this case, there was extensive sampling on both sides, and where they had the hit, it was a very low hit, but it was in one of these backwater areas in a pool disconnected from the lake. I think from the management side, Sudeep mentioned the warming climate. There's nothing we can do locally about that, but certainly you all as citizens can act about that on the broader scale. The thing that we can do locally is reduce nutrient load. And fortunately for us, the things that reduce nutrient load are the same things that we're already doing to improve the clarity of the lake. So doubling down on those activities is also likely to help us prevent the next cyanotoxin demand from occurring in our region.
Right, thank you. Okay, a wrap-up question, and then we'll get to your questions in the audience. If you had a magic wand, and I want everyone to answer this, and could do one thing to improve Tahoe's clarity, what would it be? And you are not allowed to say hug a scientist.
I'll go first. Make our winters colder. So our whole system of water delivery in California is predicated on basically a snow talent, where the Sierras contain the snow and our precipitation comes as snow and then runs off slowly through the year and feeds water down into California. But when we start getting rain on snow events during midwinter, that affects our snowpack, but then it also affects the particles that then get carried in. And then the timing of that, relative to what we refer to as the spring freshet, basically the biggest pulse of snow runoff, that affects erosion and affects the amount of particles that get transported into the lake. And so if we can have colder winters and prevent those rain and snow events, that will go a long way to helping clarity, but then also help the water distribution system as we have it in place.
Am I allowed to ask you how we're supposed to make the winters colder?
You said a magic wand. Magic wand it is.
Sure, Dan.
I guess I would fast forward 55 years of implementation in the region, and we've got a long list of roadways that we still want to treat and stormwater runoff that we still want to capture. And we've got over 600 acres of wetlands that we've identified projects on that we'd like to implement. So if I could wave my wand today, all of that would be funded and done tomorrow.
Oh, that's magical. That's amazing.
Alex said colder winters.
I know, well, he's gonna get two.
Mine's way cheaper.
I know, yours is cheaper. Two, I might give you two, but the big one I have, and it's gonna be a bit cliche, but my parents are in the audience, and about 12, 15 years ago, I worked up in the polar Arctic near Santa Claus's house, and we satellite phoned down from there, and it was 90 degrees in the summer. And that moment in that time made me realize, I don't care what people think about shifting climate. We gotta stop reducing the carbon inputs into the atmosphere. That was a turning point for me. And so if I had a magic wand, I'd want every person in this audience with financial means, non-financial means, with their energy levels, just to stop loading as much carbon into the atmosphere. That's gonna help us here. And I can't tell you more that I just wish that wand could happen quickly, and it's going to be very painful making it happen. But because that's a super wand, right? And that's wand is not around. I'd say I'd love to see a magic wand where we engage and solve the tourism and visitation issue here in a way that's practical and allows many people to experience the lake, people that don't have money, and people that do have money, and making that transportation burden lower. That to me is a pretty exciting area of research. I know we're excited. I've talked to Dan about this in our laboratory, about starting to tackle transportation and sustainability. I know the agencies in our last week's Lake Tahoe Summit, by having Secretary Buttigieg here, it's a priority. So my magic wand would be fix transportation, let's have some buses, let's have boats going around the lake, and let's give people the experience that they do deserve while being up here, while allowing our local population not to feel stressed by the amount of visitation.
Right, thank you. Very hard to see, but do we have questions? Bring them up. Oh my goodness. Okay, we've got some great ones. Well, this is right on what you just said, Sudeep, so we'll go with this one. How do you balance recreational demand with lake health and help quash frustration with environmental efforts in the groups that push their efforts?
I'll just say I don't know, but we have an active science advisory council that has listened to our managers and to the population and the stakeholders, and we are actively engaging and thinking about what that looks like in the future. And so I wish I had a clear answer for you.
I don't have the answer either. One of the things that has come up in working with our science community and other partners is not necessarily highlighting the total number of people here, because we think we've had basically the same number of people visiting Tahoe on an annual basis for the better part of the last 25 or 30 years. But what we've really seen is a dramatic shift in what those people are doing when they get here and where they're going when they get here. So if you've been in the region for a long time or you visited Tahoe around the turn of the century, we had roughly 3 times as many visitors at our casinos. And we don't have, so casinos have lost 2/3 of their clientele, but we've got the same number of people in our region. And the reason I link that to what Sudeep mentioned about transportation is this is a massive infrastructure challenge for the entire region, because we're a region that grew up and it was oriented around these casinos as our core areas for visitation. And there's lots of infrastructure there to manage visiting. And we are struggling to implement that same level of infrastructure. Not struggling, we're just slow to adapt. And so now we're getting more people at our beaches, more people on the hiking trail, more people skiing. And we are slowly adapting and evolving our infrastructure to meet that shifting demand for outdoor recreation in our region.
Great, thank you. There's so many good questions. I apologize in advance that we are not going to be able to get to all of them. This one's really interesting. Could you please address how quickly or slowly the currents and gyres in the lake are moving invasive species, plastics, and even the recent sewage spill?
I could take that one. So a gyre is basically a large rotating parcel of water. And when I say large, it's on the scale of the entire north end of the lake. So in Lake Tahoe, every summer, because of the way that the wind's set up, we generally have two main gyres that form, one in north and one in south, basically divided by McKinney Bay. So basically comes down, and right around where Homewood is, there's a transport mechanism that then transports water from McKinney Bay over towards Dead Man Point on the other side of the lake, just south of Sand Harbor. And so this process, these gyres, it moves water around just like in the ocean, horizontally on an order of, it's in about 5 days, will complete a complete turn in the lake. And so this is a mechanism that really moves particles around the water, whether or not it's the veligers of invasive clams or Asian clams, which the veligers are basically baby clams that are put into the water, and they get ejected around by these currents. Or whether or not it's particles that we're putting particles on one beach, we're putting plastics on one beach, they're going to be transported around the lake. So there is a natural connectivity to the lake that redistributes particles, redistributes pollutants around the entire, and redistributes species around the entire lake. So there's this constant connectivity. And we were talking earlier about this interconnectivity between the pelagic and the nearshore. And it's not just an onshore, offshore exchange, but it's also a horizontal exchange that's moving particles around the water, where what we do on a beach in South Lake will eventually come to the North Lake. And that's a really important mechanism to understand. And it happens, there's a seasonal basis to it, there's a daily basis to it, and there's an annual trend to it. So we have to understand what these overall implications are.
So no more North Shore versus South Shore. We're all in it together.
Okay, very quickly, because we're running out of time, but Dennis had to leave, unfortunately. But if somebody can answer, Dennis did a great job of talking about discovering the mudsnails and then monitoring them. But can somebody very succinctly say why mudsnails are bad in Lake Tahoe?
Yeah, in short, mudsnails won't just live in the lake. They're going to live in your streams and your higher elevation lakes. That's most likely the case. They're movers. They're real movers and shakers of the bottom world. But they do two things. They're going to eat algae and bacteria, but there's so many of them. They're going to excrete or poop out bacteria, or poop out nutrients that cause bacteria and algae to grow. That is one worry I have, or that we have as the science community when we did an external review with scientists. The second one is they're going to eat food that is available for all of my other native critters at the bottom of the lake that might support the fishery or that are endemic, meaning they only live at Lake Tahoe. And I worry that they're going to compete with our native species. And so, one could get depressed about this, or one could say, well, let's figure out where they're going to go, so we can figure out a management action that might allow some of these fishes to keep living, for example, or where we might predict algal blooms to be. So that's the world I live in, not the disaster zone so much as we need to put get some science money to figure out where they're going to go, what streams, what lakes, what part of Lake Tahoe, and that's the next area of frontier for us, I think, in science.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much. I'm looking at the clock, and I think it's time to wrap up. Can we have a round of applause? I am certain that we have extra food. I know we have wine, we have sparkling water, so please don't feel like you have to rush out of here, and I'm sure hopefully our panelists can stick around, so if we didn't get to your questions, they'll be here to answer them.
Hi, I'm Mel Simon. I'm with TEDxReno, and I wanted to thank all of you for coming tonight to hear this most amazing information about our lake I want to thank all of our speakers. If you guys would stand up, we're going to get a picture. And all of our volunteers, would you come on up to the front? Thank you so much for helping us make this such an amazing event. Speakers with Tahoe Fun people, all volunteers, come on up here. We'll get a quick picture of everybody. And audience, stay tuned because there is more food and drink and you get to talk to these amazing speakers when we're done. Christian,